Hi guys. So I wanted to go over the answers to the last assignment everybody did, and there were some commonalities in terms of what you got right and wrong. So this is the easiest way to go over things. Um, First, hope you had fun, a little fun playing Chair the Fed. Sometimes we can do that. It would be fun to do a class and vote on our actions and things like that. But if you played a couple times, great. You can mess around with it too. Maybe you could do the wrong action if you haven't done that. Anyway, so let's get to number two. The most common answer on number two, well, maybe not the most common, but the most common incorrect answer on number two was to say that 2A was 3,000 and 2B was 27,000. So you're on the right track if you say that, because you're trying to subtract the initial money out. But remember, you have to do the money multiplier and then subtract the initial deposit. So in 2A, we have the money multiplier is 10 and the maximum amount of money that can be put in the system. And remember now, this is M2. So M2 includes all of those savings. So it's not just the cash. So you do the initial deposit, you multiply by 10, you get $30,000. Remember, when you're looking for M2, you're going to see words like total money or overall money supply, things like that. Then in 2B, you subtract out the initial deposit. So 2A was the Fed creating the money. And when the Fed creates the money, it's all new money. Now, every day the Fed does this when they buy bonds. In today's climate, they're doing it more than ever. But usually they're always injecting new money into the system. And that's because our economy is growing. If our GDP is growing at 2% a year, there has to be money to facilitate those transactions. So all the time, our money supply is increasing. Now, in 2B, though, the money already existed. The $3,000 already existed as part of M1. So, as you could see here, you have to subtract out the initial deposit. So you do the overall money supply and you say still 30,000, but then since that money already existed, you drop down to $27,000. So you have to keep in mind the difference between 2A and 2B when the Fed when the Fed is creating the money versus when the money already existed as part of cash as part of M1. Now let's go down to number three. There's no real problems in number three. I just want to point out though that when you have your initial deposit of $3,000, look at what I've put here. So that $2,700, remember that's either going to be called excess reserves or loans if it's loaned out to others. And maybe even a split. Maybe the bank wants to hold another $700 of excess reserves and loan out $2,000. That's up to them. But that's going to be, it's in the same pile of money, and it just depends what the Fed or what the bank wants to do with it. Then we get into a little bit more complex situation. We have the leverage ratio here. I gave this to you. I didn't ask you to figure this out last time, but I did highlight it in red just to point out what it is. So your leverage ratio, and I probably should have just defined it for you the first time around, is overall assets over the initial equity. So all banks have to start with some money. So a bunch of guys put some money in. They say, hey, we're going to start a bank. So they start a bank. That's the initial capitalization. After that, they need to attract deposits. And if they can track deposits with a little bit of initial cash, so people trust that that bank is going to be around, then the overall assets grow because then that bank will loan out those deposits. So what we have here is a leverage ratio is total assets over initial equity. And so you get the $1,000 over 50. This leverage ratio is 20. Now, the concept of leverage is what this big explanation is about here. So the initial investment increased 100% in our situation in 4B. So let's say assets in the Bank of Cohen increased just 5% to $1,050. On the asset side, a lot of things can happen. Let's just say the securities performed well. So this bank had the securities of $100. Let's say they performed better than expected. So if that's the case, then the liabilities and the assets always have to equal each other. So the debtors and depositors, that's only equal to $950. So this bank is holding $800 for deposits. They have $150 in debt. That's $950. Now, if the overall assets increased because those securities performed well, now that means the 5% increase in assets increased owners' capital to $100. That's a 100% increase. The owner started the bank with $50. The bank investments or something performed well. So now the asset side is, instead of being 1,000, it's 1,050. Since the bank owes depositors 800 and the bank only has $150 in debt, there's $100 left over. The owners have increased their wealth from $50 to $100. So that's a 100% increase. So a lot of people got this wrong. So go back and make sure you understand this piece about how the owner's equity can increase or decrease. Of course, by the same token, if the bank becomes uncapitalized, then the bank would be bankrupt. And so if the securities perform poorly, and depositors took out the money, the bank wouldn't have any money left. So leveraging one's money is both a powerful way to increase an initial investment, but it's also a risky thing to do. The bank could fall, the bank's money could decrease significantly, and then the bank would be technically bankrupt, even though they might have loans out and people might still have deposits on paper in there. The bank would be undercapitalized and technically bankrupt. Now, I want you to understand the idea of capitalism, or the idea of leverage. So, take a look at 4C and this other explanation here. So, using other people's money is a powerful way to grow wealth, one's own wealth, because a small amount of starting capital can greatly increase overall wealth. The most common place we see this effect in action is in real estate. So, when we buy a house, the most standard down payment is 20%. The other 80% is somebody else's money, but we call it a mortgage. So I go out, I buy a house. Let's say we have a house price of $300,000. So one's initial down payment would be $60,000. Great. That's your standard 20%. If you go below 60,000, you have to get some other insurance and things like that. So standard down payment is 20%. That's what everybody saves up for. So that means that the mortgage is $240,000. So let's say we complete this transaction, and then later on, the home value increases 10%. So now, instead of being a $300,000 house, it's a $330,000 house. Now, the mortgage is repaid. So the initial mortgage was $240,000. There's now $90,000 remaining. That's a 50% increase in the initial investment. I put down 60. I'm pulling out 90 after the home sale has increased. Hey, that's a great investment. I went up $30,000 on a $60,000 investment. Very pleased about that. Now, keep in mind, though, that fees and bank interest make this a little bit more difficult in the real world. But that said, a hot real estate market could attract investors. And this was what was going on in 2008, or I guess 2006 and 7, and then we had the crash in 2008. Everybody felt that this was a great way to make money. And you could see why. You have a small amount of money put down. Everybody's happy when the home increases in value. Of course, if the home drops in value, that's where the problems begin. And that's what we saw during the Great Recession. Next, we had problem number 5. So this bank was started by 3 friends, who each contributed $100. That's your owner's equity. The bank started small, but with a new business loan of $2,700, they eventually attracted $30,000 in deposits. This bank has a reserve requirement of 5%. They also chose to hold $3,000 worth of municipal bonds. So take a look at what they did here. We have deposits, we have debt, and we have owner's equity. So on the liability side, we have $33,000. On the asset side, we also have $33,000. There's your 5% reserves. Remember, reserves are just based on deposits, so we attracted $30,000 in deposits. We loaned, so this bank kept $1,500. They loaned out the $28,500, and with securities, they basically had their debt and their owner's equity put into treasury bonds, things like that. So there's your $3,000. So your money multiplier is just 1 over the reserve ratio. So the money multiplier here is 20. I'm not asking that question about what's the maximum amount, but you would do 30,000 times 20 if you were asked that question. And next, the leverage ratio. So the leverage ratio is total assets over bank capital. So in this case, total assets is $33,000. The bank capital, the initial money to start this bank, was just $300. So we have a leverage ratio of 110. It's a high leverage ratio. Now, 6 and 7, just to make sure, you have to remember buy equals bigger and sell equals smaller. So hopefully you got that correct. So after listening to this, go back, check over your own work, and fill out the short reflection. on this, and then you can move on to the next thing. Thanks very much.